let's talk politics, particularly in Canberra at the moment. I know there's a lot of you at home that don't recognise a traditional party that you would vote for, particularly on the coalition side. So today, I want to bring in Simon Welsh and talk about the left, because the problems on the right seem to be masking some of the vulnerabilities on the left right now. Simon, great to see you. He is a director at Redbridge Group. What are those vulnerabilities as well? Because I think the landslide election for Labor and the polling that we've seen subsequently really masks some problems that they've got underlying.
Yeah, that's right, Laura. And the problems, or the vulnerabilities, is perhaps a better term for the left and particularly the Labor Party, are more strategic in nature. So they're not here and now problems. I mean, obviously, you've got this massive majority in Parliament, but noting that came off a relatively low primary vote, that's important to note. But they're still holding that in the polling. They're still holding that kind of primary vote. We're not seeing the same slide that we're seeing on the right. But there are vulnerabilities there, and the vulnerability is that the same sort of anti-establishment trend that we're seeing on the right absolutely exists on the left. When we're talking to voters, when we're researching voters, we absolutely see that anti-establishment vote. Hence why the primary, was relatively low at the last election, why we're seeing increasing proportion of Australians voting something other than the major parties as each election goes by. The saving grace for the Labor Party at the moment is there simply is no viable economic populist left-wing alternative. So on the right, you've got One Nation that's mopping up all that sort of anti-establishment sentiment. There's no similar thing on the left. The Greens have sort of vacated the scene. It's hard to find anyone that's talking about them. And what we're seeing in the polling is that they really haven't fixed that problem from the last election, which is that erosion of their vote in the sort of the Gen X particularly, and even the sort of the boomer cohort as well. And it's very hard for them to win seats back in the inner city if they're not picking up particularly that Gen X vote. Voters under the age of 30, Greens are still there, they're still relevant, they're still doing okay, but they're not particularly growing. So you haven't got this lightning rod on the left. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. And that's the longer term risk. And so while at the moment for Labor, you've got this sort of incrementalist adults in the room kind of positioning, which is working for them right now. And it's certainly helping, I think, as you and I have sort of talked about in previous weeks, sort of mop up some of the moderate libs that are coming off the coalition poll there as either a hedge against One Nation or in response to the dysfunction of the party. So that's kind of working for them. But equally, every day spent in that space kind of incurs a debt to this sort of outer suburban voter who is looking for serious economic reform because, like the voters on the right, they feel that the economic system is broken and no longer serves their interests. And so they are looking for that systemic reform. Now, these voters are not going to jump over to One Nation. We know that people tend to stay within their sort of ideological bounds. But if something can arise on the left, that's where the threat lies. And that's why I say it's a strategic thing. This is something that's not going to happen in days or weeks or months. This is something that is going to take quite some time to develop. But that is the longer term risk. It's exactly the same risk on the right. It's got the same causes, the same sort of economic drivers underpin it all. But it's just looking for somewhere else to land.
Unlike the left at the moment, and I'm not saying this couldn't happen, but what seems to be happening on the centre-right is the Nationals in particular trying to chase those votes they're losing to the right with One Nation, and that then drags the party or drags the parties further away from the centre. Labor's not doing that at the moment. They're not chasing those left votes. But is it happening in some electorates where, I mean, I've seen subsequent many elections. I mean, not last time, the Greens came back a bit, but inner city Brisbane seats that you'd never thought would be Green, outer suburban seats that were Liberal went Green in that state election and in the federal election indeed. So what's the cautionary tale here? With a preferential system, those centrist parties have to be careful not to chase the fringes?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think sort of Labor's risk is if it sort of thinks that, oh, look, there's this vacancy on the centre right, and we can capture that as well, and sort of try and be all things to all people, and forget about that progressive economic reform agenda that is so critical to those voters in those outer suburbs. And look, it's no surprise that if you look at where the Green vote had been growing, and as I say, it's kind of plateaued at the moment, but where it had been growing was in those outer suburban areas. It wasn't growing as much in the inner city. That was sort of, it was that kind of peak green in those spaces. So that is absolutely the risk. I think, if the pathway became, oh, we move a bit more to the right to try and capture that territory so the Libs can never get it back, I think that would end in disaster, because it exposes that left flank. And when I say left flank here, I'm not talking sort of activist left. I'm not talking the extreme left. I'm just talking people out there struggling in the suburbs that they would never use these words, that are looking for sort of that progressive economic reform policy. They don't use those words. They talk about, oh, yeah, we need big changes. We've got to change the system on housing. We've got to change the system on the way supermarkets work. They talk about those sorts of things. They're the people that we're talking about here.
Okay. What do you think when you look at Canberra right now? I mean, I had a really instructive chat with Paul Kelly yesterday, and on the right he says he's never seen it this bad. It's existential, and it's driven by ideology and kind of the false prophet of a Trump and Farage overseas.
I think it's an inflection point, and I think. Yes, absolutely. You can't underestimate the effect that Trump is having as a cautionary tale to the Australian electorate. So whenever we do focus groups, whenever we do polling, sort of people's attitudes to Trump is one of, wow, then but for the grace of God go we.
So just to labour on that for a moment, is Trump popular in Australia?
No. There's a very small proportion of the population, pick a number, 10, 15%, that sort of, pro-Trumpian and would like to see that kind of thing replicated here. But most people just see the dysfunction, they see the chaos, and things like, don't underestimate the down scoring of Australia's efforts and Australia's losses in those war on terror that happened recently. Those sorts of things sort of just send a signal to people. So definitely not popular. But I think the other interesting thing around the sort of the chaos that we've been seeing over the course of January so far is it's not just ideological. This is the iceberg reaching above the waterline of the demographic changes that you and I have been talking about for some time on this program that are happening in the Australian electorate. This is a generational shift that is coming in the electorate. As the boomers move on and the younger generations become the power on the electoral roll, and it's those tectonic plates are moving, which if you're a political party and you don't move with the times, you don't move with them, you fall down the gaps. And I think that is what we are seeing at the moment with the Liberal Party in particular, and the Nationals at the same time being eaten on their right flank. So I think it's absolutely an inflection point, and don't underestimate the underlying demographic change in the Australian society that's driving all of this.
Simon, good to talk to you. We'll speak soon.
Thanks, Laura.